Hi everybody, welcome. Hey Kevin, how are you? Good to see you. Thank you for being here. I'm Bill Campbell, I'm a music professor, and it's really my pleasure to be up here to welcome you and our guest, Jason Snell. Now, I'd also like to point out that we have Carol de Volder from Psychology Department back there, and Mike Opar from Engineering. And the three of us are helping to bring this event here. It's really because of Carol's interest in this, though. So thanks very much for bringing us into this, for making us a part of this. Anyway, I don't want to say too much. I want to get into everything here. But Jason went to school at the University of Iowa. He actually, his discipline wasn't in any of the things that we were just discussing really at all. It was graphic design. Yeah, but he studied, like all of us do, the things that really interested him, right, and found a way to really make a career out of this, which is quite incredible. He's dividing his time between a number of places right now, including Berlin and, of course, tonight, Iowa. So we're really fortunate to have him here in the land of everything is great with our caucus, what's wrong with you? You thought you were going to escape anything from that, but oh well. Yeah, so Jason has written a lot of music, a lot of it electronic genre in the techno area, but he's also written a lot of other kind of music. It's taken him into writing for films. I think you've written for 9 films right now at this point, and in some other areas as well. But as you know, he's here to show us this connection that he's got with his brain and musical sounds. That, I'm a composer, I'm going to let him, describe more of that, but that's the intro that you got.
Great.
That's cool. Yeah, so please help us welcome Jason Snell.
Thank you for being here. I'm going to quickly go through an intro to the project before I perform it. I'll perform it once, and then we can chat, see what questions come up. And then we'll probably do a second short performance. Each one will be about 5 minutes, and then another chat. But I like to give somewhat of an intro ahead of time, just so you understand the signal flow between my brain and then what's coming out of the speakers and what you'll see on the screen. This project began, it was actually from a dream I had late in 2017. And I've gotten a lot of creative ideas from dreams over the years, whether stories, illustrations, paintings, and then this project came up. With this particular dream, this is all in the dream, I'd been working on well, I'll just read it. So it was December 3rd, 2017, and contextually, I had been in LA all of November, staying with a friend, and she had just gotten a puppy. And so around like 4 a.m. each morning, the puppy would stand on my head and lick my face, and so I was sleeping terribly. And I flew up to Seattle to do a techno show, and it was my first full night's sleep in like a month, and so my dreams were really heavy and really intense. And this is what came out. I was at a mix between the NYU and Berkeley campus. I saw a woman I had given some of my recent songs to, the tracks I'd been making with a friend of mine. I knew in the dream she was a New York Times reviewer and a biologist. I asked her what she thought of the music that I gave her, and she replied, "Well, it's really not remarkable, is it?" I felt hurt, but didn't show it. I walked away from the building where I saw her and through campus, brainstorming how to make the music more interesting to her specifically. Then I wondered if there were patterns in human DNA that I could map to MIDI notes or rhythm patterns that would be a cool concept album. So I woke up, wrote down the dream right away before it disappeared. I find if I don't write them down, they float away and stay gone. And so within an hour or so, I Googled human DNA patterns, and I came across this website, which is NIH, National Institute of Health. And I found exactly what I was looking for. So the dream had pointed towards this idea of taking these chromosome patterns, and I started to screenshot them, bring them into Photoshop, slice it into grids, figure out what notes they would be, and then bring it over to Ableton and make sheet music out of it, essentially. And then right at the top of the screen is the name of these sequences, which is primary assembly, and that became the project name. So the original idea was that this was making music based on human DNA, and it got me thinking about how I can make music based on the body, just the central building blocks of the human body. Then, it's not really ceremonious or as interesting as a dream, but I was on Instagram about 6 weeks later, just scrolling through, and this ad came up for this MUSE headband. And is a commercially available EEG. Does everyone know what an EEG is? Raise your hand if you don't know what an EEG is. Great. So an EEG, do you know what an EKG is, like a heart rate monitor? Raise your hand if you don't know what EKG is. So, you know, if you, like in a show where you see the heartbeat on a monitor, and then, you know, if it's like a dramatic show at a hospital, and then it flatlines, and they're like, you know, give them the shocks or whatever, and then the heart rate comes back, that's an EKG. So it's electrocardiogram. EEG is electroencephalogram. Thank you. I'm glad that some scientists are here. And that is reading the electrical activity and patterns coming off the brain. So EKG is reading off the heart, and EEG is reading off the brain. So this device was developed by a company that has a meditation app. And so you buy this, you get the meditation app, and as you meditate, it gives you positive feedback for going into a meditative state. With this particular app, I think if your brain is busy, you hear you know, thunderstorms and rain, and as you calm down, the rain stops and birds start chirping. So that's the existing system that you can buy if you get one of these devices. And they're not expensive. Used, I've seen them as cheap as $100, so it's really accessible in terms of technology. So I looked up the app and immediately was curious to see if they had an open API or an SDK that was available, and that's a software development kit. Essentially, that allows an independent programmer like myself to be able to get data from the device without using their app. So basically, I was checking to see, can I program my own app with this device? And as it turned out, at the time, they did have an open SDK, open API. And so I was able to get one of these devices, and I've programmed iPhone apps since 2009. And so I was able to look at their documentation, figure out what sort of code it would take to get brainwave data off this EEG into my own system rather than their system. And initially, my proof of concept was I got this, and prior to this project, I had done several iOS projects that laid the groundwork where I could launch this project really quickly. In 2014, I made an iOS app that was a music sequencer with an AI in it. So the more you composed in this particular app, it would learn your specific compositional style and then produce music that sounds like you. From that, I had a MIDI framework, so I could have iPhones talk to synthesizers, drum machines. MIDI is a language where like drum machines and keyboards and sequencers can talk to each other. It's like a syncing. You can send notes or different types of musical changes in between machines. And then I also had the ability to do a looping sequencer, and then I also had the AI, which I ended up not using for this project. And then in 2016, I started working with a dancer in Berlin where she wanted to be able to move, and her movement composed the music. And we had met, and I was like, oh, I can program that. And we explored several different motion sensors and then settled on these sensors called MYO, M-Y-O. And their wristbands are really durable, so if they fly off during a dance performance, they don't break. one of the earlier prototypes that was tying iPhones to her, and they tend to fly off and crack. And so as she moved, and we would map it, and that was the creative process, is figuring out what sort of movement would trigger what sound on the drum machine or the synthesizer. And we would program sounds that intuitively felt right, you know, as she moved. You know, is it a sweep sound, is it a bass sound, is it a string sound, is it a snare sound, whatever it was. And then the actual performance was all improv, because I created the system, and we knew that by the time the performance happened, anything she did movement-wise would look cool and sound cool. And so it was about creating a structure, and then the actual performance was improv, and that's similar to this system. A key component of that was the wristbands were Bluetooth, and so there was no wired connection between her and the computer. The motion data would be transmitted via Bluetooth to my iPhone, and then the iPhone would convert it to musical information. So that's, with that background, once I purchased this, I could grab the MIDI framework from the AI, and I could grab the Bluetooth framework from the motion sensor, and I could grab at least a rudimentary, it's called data mapping. It's where you take one set of information and convert it into another. And so with this, with the dance project, I was taking motion data, like the accelerometer that's in your phone, so as you move your phone around, it knows it's moving at a certain velocity, and then outputting music data. So the first proof of concept, I had this, it was transmitting to a really simple version, my first version of the iPhone app, and I was running a MIDI cable into a synthesizer. And there was a light on the synthesizer that if I dropped my delta waves, which I'll explain later, I wanted it to press a key on the keyboard. So essentially my goal was, can I think something, and then a key presses on the keyboard without touching it. So it and I put it on, wired it up, and looked at the keyboard and was like, and then the light went on. And that was my eureka moment. It was like, if I'm able to play this note with my mind, eventually I can evolve this system over and over where I can play an entire composition with my mind. What we'll see tonight in terms of signal flow, so EEG will be on my head, it reads my brain electricity, it goes over to Bluetooth to this iPhone app, and then the cable from the iPhone app goes into the laptop, and it's playing Ableton, which is a music software that has several several synthesizer, digital synthesizers loaded in different tracks. And so the actual audio source, the source of the sounds will be Ableton. And that goes out the audio amplifier and then out the speakers. At the same time, the brainwave data will be relayed to a different iPhone, which is connected to the projector, so you'll see my brainwaves live as I'm performing. So there will be a correlation between what you see visually and what you hear. And for me, that's important because one of the difficulties of working with the EEG is that brainwaves are invisible. And so how do you communicate what's going on in the brain? How do you externalize it in a way that makes sense? And to do it just as audio is invisible too, so it's more of a threshold for understanding if there isn't some sort of visual, and that's the power of having a visual, is you'll be able to see my brainwaves live as you hear the music being composed. All right, we'll get into that later. So I'll perform for a couple minutes, and before I get started, are there any preliminary questions before I put this thing on and you hear? There'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards, but anything right off the bat before I get started? Yes?
MUSE is the name of that
device.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep. Any other questions? All right, I'll get started. questions about what you've seen? Yes, in the back.
So, as I'm watching these different brain waves, are you really focused on each of these different waves, or are you thinking of a particular note and a sound, and you're just letting those brain waves that is a gamma, theta, alpha, are they just doing what they do in response to thinking of a note, or are you trying to control those waves themselves?
It's kind of a mix between the two. So initially when I began this project, I was coming with the idea of playing a keyboard. You know, how do I play a keyboard with my brain? And the thing that I've learned the more I've used this is that the input device isn't my hand, and I was trying to replicate, you know, playing something with my hand, playing individual notes. With this, it's a different instrument, and that instrument is the brain, you know, the 3-pound organ that has electricity and chemicals moving through it. And what I'm picking up on, it's not the chemicals, so I can't pick up on mood, but I pick up on the electricity of it. And so the way that I picture it is that it's a sphere with all these electrical currents moving through it. And the way to change those electrical currents is through shifts in thought, consciousness, meditation, focusing on the music, going to different parts of my psyche. It's almost like moving around in a physical space. And it doesn't feel like my body, but it feels like it's an entity that's me, consciousness, moving around this physical organ that is fluid, and that as I move, it sends out these movements of electricity in this new type of instrument, of this sphere. And originally I was trying to quantize things, you know, create a structure that was similar to my background, which is electronic music, using drum machines, synthesizers, sequencers. And I've crossed this threshold where I've really realized that it's a different instrument, and it's going to produce different types of sounds. You know, a drum machine makes loop-based music. You know, you make a loop, you hit start, and it's going to play the same thing every 4 beats or 8 beats. And with this, the shape of the music is biomorphic. You know, it's the activity of my brain forming music based on what the brain wants to do. And what I found in terms of the behavior of the music is that it very much feels like moving through a fluid. And so there will be these arcs up and arcs down, and a movement similar to, akin to surfing, rather than, you know, if I'm driving a car, I can make a 90-degree turn fairly well. But if I'm driving a boat through a fluid, through a lake, when I turn right, there's all this momentum and movement that makes the arc bigger. That's the way the composing feels in this system, is that it feels like I'm putting something into a fluid container, and it has ripples coming out, and there's a physics element where the container, once I send thoughts or intentions into it and it creates activity, I have to wait for it to become still again in order to have that same impact. So for example, let's I'm at a pool that's still, and I slap the pool hard, and it creates all these waves, and it's a dramatic impact. So that would be like a lot of bass, or a big impact in the sound coming out. In that pool, if I hit the water again, you know, 1 second later, it's not going to make that much of an impact because the whole medium is already moving, it's already dynamic. But if I wait for the waves to cool down and then do an impact, it's going to be big again. So it's very much similar to the physics of water. And so the compositional method would be more like moving a body through fluid. Did that answer it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, Carl?
Notice that when you're doing all of this, you're standing perfectly still.
Yeah.
Is that to keep your actual physical movement from creating interference, or is that to allow you to concentrate or to
it's a bit of both. One of the things with the EEG is if I move around too much or even speak, movement on the forehead can cause the sensors to slip. I've experimented, I put this on a friend who's an opera singer, and with opera it's very expressive, you know, it's eyebrows, and so we just kept losing the signal. I was like, can you keep your forehead still? She's like, no, this is opera, like I need to express myself. And so part of being still is the physicality of the EEG. The other is that the composition process, I've meditated for as long as I've made music and worked with computers, so it's 3 threads in my life that have merged with this project of music composition, engineering, and meditation. And so the deepest possible states I can get into is if I'm actually sitting and being still, and allows me to move through an internal psychic space with greater ease than if I'm also concentrating on staying standing. Or if I were to start moving, so much mental thought goes into that, where really the best place for me to compose is getting to a quiet place and then making minute decisions, which are very easy to hear audibly come out of the system. Because when I first put it on, you know, I'm here in a new room, you know, with new people, and my brain's like, what's going on, what's going on? Like everyone's, you know, and that's part of the intent of the project is for whoever's witnessing it to see exactly where I'm at. And that was a response to my experience of years of doing performances, you know, with a drum machine and with a keyboard, where it didn't matter if I was bored or nervous or excited, the music coming out of those machines was always going to be the same. With this, if I'm feeling distracted or anxious or calm, you will hear it and you'll see it. You'll see it in the brainwaves. And I lost my train of thought. Did I? Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
So have you ever just played around with it, like put it on and say, what does it sound like when I'm solving an engineering problem?
Yep.
When I'm remembering my first kiss, you know,
Yep.
or just maybe a traumatic event, and just to see what kinds of things happen. Is that part of your creative process?
Absolutely. So early on, once I got the visuals and music programmed, and each time I do a build, I try different kits. So what you hear tonight, you know, will be different in a month or 2 months. So this is build 1.9. So in earlier builds, you know, I put it on. I tried things like just answering emails, coding the actual software and doing renders, and then hearing the output, and then coding, so a lot of the data mapping. I think one of the most interesting things I've done is set up the system, had the speakers where I could hear them, and then laid down and took a nap. And what was interesting about that was, as my consciousness was moving down and getting calmer, it's like I had a rope back to consciousness, which was this audio input. And as I would go down another step, and then, you know, when you're starting to fall asleep and it's kind of it's not fully a dream, but it's that early hypnagogic, like something will come up and you're like, oh, that's weird. But it doesn't seem weird because you're falling into a dream. When I hit those, then I hear it, because that's a different mental state, and the waves change and it triggers a sound. And that becomes the anchor of like, oh, I'm taking a nap. You know, it's a reminder, and then I go deeper and deeper. So that's been one of my most enjoyable experiences, is taking a short nap with it and hearing for as long as I'm conscious, you know, this lifeline back into consciousness. I was in Berlin in November and performed at a sound festival there. And one of the promoters has synesthesia, and so was very interested in putting the system on her. So a few days later, I met her and her friends at her apartment, and they tried all sorts of things in terms of thinking about different topics and what their brain would do. And particularly her with the synesthesia, she put it on and closed her eyes, and as she heard the music coming into her ears, so her brain is triggering the sound and then it goes back in. So she's having the biofeedback, but then visually having a very intense visual state with her eyes closed. And what was curious about that was, what is the cause and what is the effect? So the brain activity is creating the sound, and the sound then creates the visual? Or does the visual create the brain activity, which then creates the sound, which then increases the visual? So it takes cause and effect and starts moving them really close together, where it's no longer a linear relationship between this happens and this is the output. And that's what's really fascinating about this system, is the biofeedback aspect, where those two get really close together and it becomes more of a conversation rather than a one-way cause and effect. Carol?
I just wanted to mention, I don't know how many of the students here know what synesthesia is, and so I was just going to explain.
Please.
It's basically your sensory wiring is a bit messed up, and you hear colors, or you see smells, or numbers are represented as colors or shapes or something like that. So it's a transmuting of the senses that makes it really interesting, because you're taking, for you it's normal brain waves, so for somebody else it's a whole different situation.
Yep, thank you for that. I didn't think about the synesthesia. And so what was interesting about her brainwaves as we watched it, you know, she was in her space, was all of them were maxed out. Her whole brain was lighting up in a way that I haven't seen with anyone else. Because normally when I perform beta and gamma, which are the less vivid of the lines, they're kind of a gray green and a gray blue, are typically pretty low. And when I compose or listen to electronic music, those tend to be low. When the opera singer had it on, her beta and gamma were at the very top and her alpha and delta were low. And Carol, you may know more about this. My theory was that beta and gamma had to do with language, because she was singing in German and Italian, and that had to do with breath, because she was doing circular breathing. That was just a theory based on the situation. Whereas electronic music is very nonverbal, and there's nothing specific I'm doing with breath to raise gamma, whereas her breath was very intentional and very circular. So it was interesting to see the one with synesthesia have all cylinders firing. I'd never seen such a consistently high level. All the lines that you see here were at the top, just bouncing off the top.
How do you determine which sounds go to which brainwave activity? Do you got a feeling, or do you just have a certain inkling beforehand?
I've done two different methods. So the first one is using a creative, intuitive method, similar to when I was working with the dancer and the motion sensors. So when the dancer did a motion that was small, I didn't want that to be a real big sound, because visually it didn't line up. And that was our test, was as she's moving, does the sound make sense to that movement? So if she had a larger movement, it would have a bigger sound or a sweeping sound, or if she had a dropping, maybe it's a bass hit happens. So it's a similar process with this of what waves go up when I feel certain things. And so I chose sounds over time, testing them. I've chosen sounds that match the psychic state I feel. And what that does is that when I hear a sound that feels the way that I'm feeling, when that gets triggered, that biofeedback happens again, and it starts reinforcing it. And one of the interesting things in terms of meditation is, normally when I meditate, not with this system, but just normally, I can go a little bit down into relaxation. But with this system, I meditate and I go down, and then the sounds get dreamier and bassier with me, and then I can then ladder, step down further and further. So I've been able to get much deeper into meditations than I could without this system, because the music becomes the platform that I can ladder both up and down. I've moved up into really heightened ecstatic states as well with the system, going upwards, or very, very relaxed states going downwards. So for me, it's important that the sound emulates the psychic state. So that's the main one I use. For the sound festival in Berlin, I used a different system, because they asked for a really specific translation of the brain waves directly to sound. So rather than the brain waves creating sheet music, they just wanted a very scientific output of the lowest wave, which is delta, would be the lowest sub-sound coming out of the speakers, and the highest wave, gamma, would be the highest sound coming out. So it's just a direct translation. Most of, this will be useful, most of brain waves are below the auditory level. So we can hear, so this is brain waves, and then this is audio waves. This is a frequency spectrum. So sound waves, the lowest sub-bass we can hear is around 20 hertz, around 20, 25, around there. And most brain waves are below that. So delta waves are around 1 hertz. So it's one of the slowest, most fundamental waves that we have, and really in reality. And it's interesting that the brain produces waves that are the building blocks of everything we hear. And then the real trip is if you go about 40 octaves up, those same frequencies then relate to light and color. And so if you have the brain, you go up a few octaves, and then you have the sounds that correspond to those exact frequencies, and then you go 40 octaves up, and those same frequencies become light and color. Technically, they're different spectrums. One's a compression spectrum, sound is compression, and light is electromagnetic, but the frequencies align. So some of the creative choices I've made align with that. That was a little bit of an aside, but with that sound festival in Berlin, delta was the sub-bass, and for me, when my delta goes up, it's actually a stimulation, anxiety. You know, if someone were to say my name and I turn, my delta goes up. So it was odd for me for this warm bass sound to be coming out of the speakers when I was having a stress response. It didn't align psychically or psychologically. And it was worth doing that experiment, but it confused my brain. I wasn't able to do those deep dives with the biofeedback. So instead, I assigned the low, dreamy sub-basses to alpha, because alpha goes up when I close my eyes and I dive into meditation. My alpha goes up and up.
So you said most brainwave frequencies are not audible. Does that imply that there are some brainwave frequencies that are audible?
Yes, so this has a more specific, so audibility kicks in around 20, so some high beta and then gamma waves are in the audible range. So if you took those frequencies, translate directly to an oscillation or oscillator, for example in a synthesizer, you can have a direct translation. They'd be very, very low, you know, just. And I've seen other EEG projects that have done that, and one of the challenges was how do you sonify those lower waves? And my solution was just to raise the whole set up a couple of octaves so they maintain the relationships. There was a EEG scientist, artist in Berlin that chose to keep the gamma directly, not to pitch it up a few octaves, and to do a type of clicking sound when the lower waves were peaking. So you'd hear this rumbling bass and then a based on the wave activity. When the wave would peak, it would hit that click sound. And I'd asked him, is there anything specific about that click sound frequency-wise that related to those? And it wasn't. It was just a click sound, almost like a marker just to identify a peak of a lower wave. And that one reminded me more of something underwater that just peaks up like a submarine every once in a while, where you see just a little bit and you know there's more, but the only thing that's perceivable is something breaking the water. Was there a hand? Yes?
Yeah. Would the headband work on anything that wasn't a human thing? What if you put it on a dog?
A dog?
Yeah, no.
Well, I've gotten this question before. It's a good question. It would work on a dog. The main thing is getting through the fur and getting to the skin. Full head, human head EEGs, you know, can have sensors throughout the head, and they'll use a little bit of a gel to put right at the site, so it's a stronger connection. But yeah, you could put it on a dog. what I found, I haven't done a dog test, I haven't been able to wrestle a dog down and get this thing on him. What is also interesting is it doesn't have to be on the head. I'm going to bring up the live signal. This will probably take a second, but it will pick up the electricity in my arm, and it acts a little bit like what I found in testing different people, I have a friend who, I think her daughter's like 4 years old, and I wanted to test it both on her and her daughter to see what the difference is in age. And with her daughter, the waves were much less, they had a lot less dynamics and didn't have as many decibels. And I'm guessing because the actual organ of her brain is smaller, so it's not outputting as much electricity. Whereas an adult brain is a larger organ, produces more electricity. So if you're able to get it on a dog or a cat, I guess it's based on the size of the critter, but however big their brain is, what animal would have the biggest brain? Dolphin, maybe?
Dolphin.
Yeah, so if you could get one of these on a dolphin, it'd probably be huge
Then
dynamics.
you wouldn't have the fur problem.
No fur problem. Yes.
I have a couple questions.
Yes, please.
These could get really specific, so I'm just going to ask, rather than get really, really nerdy with you now, I mean, you've got each other, you know.
Sure, yep.
But-
And I'm happy to be here as long as you need.
But I'm
For
wondering,
afterwards.
there's a lot of predetermined sounds
Mm-hmm.
that are part of the kids,
Correct.
and each brainwave type is going to a different trigger within Ableton.
Partially. So a lot of the musical decision and mapping isn't a one-to-one relationship between a certain wave and a certain sound.
It's more just activity going on.
The main thing, the main part of the algorithm is looking at my alpha waves and my delta waves in a relational manner. So
Okay.
I'm looking at which one is dominant at a certain point and by what percentage. And that's been the best way I've been able to determine, am I more in a conscious activated state, or have I dipped down into a subconscious
I
state?
see. So it's more measuring activity than the individual frequency of each wave.
Yes.
Okay.
And
that answers-
changes are what create the music.
Got
So
it.
if my waves
So
start
although
to,
we're seeing changes in specific brainwave frequencies, that's not directly output to, say, a kick drum sound, right?
it's sending a MIDI note into a drum kit,
Yeah.
and it's shaping the filter cutoff
Uh-huh.
on the kick, and it's shaping a reverb
Right.
on the kick.
Oh, okay, so that's even, and the delay and all that? That's
Exactly.
all also, okay.
Yeah.
Then the other thing, but you're setting up the timing for the delay, which is giving us a sense of tempo as well.
Yeah. I think it's, with this one, it's just a
that's about
reverb.
60. I mean, I'm getting like this 60 BPM right
Oh,
now.
okay, yeah.
What's going on?
Yep.
Is that also predetermined then?
The tempo.
Yeah.
So the tempo can vary based on the overall brain activity. That's how this particular build works.
Okay.
I have another build where I can, I'm working on it currently, where I can wear an Apple Watch and then the tempo is set directly by my heart.
Oh, nice. Okay.
The next phase of these builds is instead of only sending in the sheet music and control changes or continuous controller signals in MIDI, which is essentially if you're turning knobs on a synthesizer, it's 0 to 127 or 1 to
Right,
128.
yeah.
So a lot of those values are being driven by the specific decibel level of a brainwave. So as a brainwave goes up, essentially I'm turning a knob with my brain. It's kind of a telekinesis scenario. The next step is to get into the fundamentals of synthesis, where I just have an oscillator in each channel, and I'm shaping the amplitude envelopes and filter envelopes to shape a sound live.
So that will give the audience changes in timbre
Yes.
and sound quality.
Yeah. Yeah. So this phase of the project is sheet music and overall shaping of the sound. And as it evolves, it'll get more into reaching into each instrument and developing it one by one.
That's gonna be fun to watch.
Yeah, totally. I'm really excited about that. Largely it's just based on time, and having the time to sit down and create that next step. What's great is every time I perform this, I see a little bit into the future of what the next steps are. And then I make that, and then I present it, and then I see a little bit into the future.
I wanna hear some more music. You guys
Yeah, I can perform again another kid. It'll take a second for this next kid to load. And it's also hard to wear glasses and EEG at the same time because they both go behind your ears.
I'm really happily surprised that no phone or other disruption has happened, so thank you.
Yeah, that's great. I didn't notice.
Very much. Now that'll happen, it just jinxes
Yep.
it. But so if you could make sure that things are still switched off.
inspire you to be concentrating so hard, or do you feel energized after you perform?
I feel dreamy. So sometimes it's coming out of it. It's a very nonverbal, dreamy place, and that I think has a lot to do with the meditation I'm used to. So sometimes I'm a little bit stumbly when moving back into verbal. I was reviewing some video footage from a performance a while back, and I was transcribing it, and I thought my sentence structures were terrible. It's just like, I can't believe I'm speaking like this in public. So sometimes it's hard to drag myself back into verbal. So it's not necessarily intense concentration, it's titration. So there will be moments of that, and then relaxing and going into, it's a very organic, cyclical type of experience, which produces the best music in my experience. What was interesting with this, and every time that I present this, it's a different experience in a different room, and different people, and a different location. What was really interesting about this one was, I was at NYU last week, and I was talking to someone in that program that also works with an EEG, and she was saying what she does to get her brain waves aligned is just to say a single word over and over, similar to a mantra. So I was like, well, I'll try that, because this whole experience is really focused on research and experimentation, trying different things. And it was just simple. I was just saying the word one. And I was doing that, kicks kept coming out. And I was like, one. And in my previous experience, I haven't had the ability to trigger such specific, a thought to one sound in the symphony or the orchestra. But for whatever reason, the level of stimulation I'm at tonight and getting in that range, for whatever reason that was working tonight. Normally, when I've tried that in the past, I've learned that the brain will respond to the first time I say that. So it'll be like, hey brain, do something. And then, it'll react to that type of thought. But then if I try to get to do it again a second or two later, it puts out less electricity. And then if I do it again, it's like, yeah, I know what you're doing. And the brain is like, I know what you're up to. You're trying to get me to do a lot of work over and over. And so it starts to become more and more efficient, and uses less and less electricity each time that trigger comes. So it's been interesting to learn about my brain through externalizing it through sound and visuals, and seeing something like that of its priority of being efficient with the electricity that it puts out, that it uses up, which makes sense. Yeah.
So, what are you thinking? Like, do you have an internal dialogue? Like, if there's a thing going on on Facebook right now, so some people have it where they can hear their voice talking inside their head while they're thinking,
Sure.
other people don't.
Mm.
Do you have that? And do you think that it would be different for people's readings, like, if they don't have that internal voice?
I think it would be different. I think that the verbalization of thought, of having that dialogue or that voice, my guess is that delta would be higher. That voice was more prominent in my head when I was younger, and I associate it with just an activation level. And there was, what was it? A few months ago, I was preoccupied with something in a way that I'm usually not, and I don't know if it was a conflict with someone. I was like, well, if they say this, and then I'm going to say this, and then they say this, that type of mental dialogue. And I put on the EEG, and my delta was just bouncing off the top. And that was my experience more consistently when I was younger. Now, I don't have that level of mental dialogue, which, is stressful, to have that amount of churning through things mentally. So in general, my delta is lower and my alpha is higher. The other thing that's interesting with alpha being high is, it's a very musical oriented thing. So if I listen to music, so if I listen to the music that's coming out, my alpha goes up, and then that creates more music, and then my alpha goes up higher. In many ways, alpha feels relaxing and soothing. It also goes up during meditation. And when I think about my experience, particularly in high school, I had a very stressful experience in high school and dropped out early because of it. And every day in high school, I just had a song in my head. And looking back, I realized that was my brain's natural way of trying to stay calm and functional. Because I think the delta, the stress waves were so high, it was just so painful just to be going through that experience, that whatever song it was just looping in my head all day, and I think that was a soothing type of wave. What I've learned about alpha there's a neuroscientist I've talked with a few times at Iowa. He has studied alpha in the way that, in general, has looked at the brain and how it does predictive functioning with music specifically. So when you're listening to music, you kind of expect what the next few seconds are going to sound like. So if there's a certain beat, you expect that beat to go along. After 8 beats or 16 or 32 beats, sometimes you expect a change to go into a chorus or a verse. And I asked him about alpha waves, and I was curious about them because they feel different than a lot of the other waves. A lot of the other waves tend to go up when there's some sort of activation or stimulation happening, whether it's verbal or physical or mental. And alpha waves are different, and from his research, he saw alpha waves were actually suppressive. And they suppressed stimulation from the environment coming in. And the example he gave, which made sense, was if I'm in a really noisy restaurant and I'm trying to talk just to you, and music is blaring, and there's dishes clattering and a bunch of noise around me, my alpha waves will go up spatially all around my head except where I'm focusing on you. And so it's a way to block out that extra stimulation so I can create focus. And in terms of meditation, that makes sense because I'm closing my eyes and I'm going into internal space, and my alpha waves go up throughout my brain. And I think it was my third performance. It was longer form, and I was able to get quite deep into things. And at the end of it, I opened my eyes, and I really had lost touch that there was an audience there. Because I had gotten very, very deep into my alpha, which is the isolating, suppressive, calming. It's a very internal space. I could just as easily someone create a system like this, and maybe they could get a way to fix to the head, and their performance would be running around the whole time and talking and being expressive. I like the space of meditation, so a lot of this system is built around my brain and tailored to my brain. And upcoming goals with this is to have this system more nuanced and dynamic, that I can put it on each person and something distinctly unique comes out for each brain. Because everyone's brain is there's a lot of general patterns which are similar, but there's always discrepancies person to person.
Have you experimented with the differences between like the internal stimuli where you just like thoughts, feelings, emotions versus like external specific visual cues or sounds or stuff like that?
Yeah. Normally external cues will spike my delta. And theta is also, seems to be a reactive stimulation, external stimulation. Delta is the lowest wave, and it picks up on some muscular movement. So if someone were to say my name, internally my theta will go up. It's a higher wave, so it's delta, and theta is right above it in terms of the frequency. So if someone said my name, I would respond to it internally, and then I would turn, and I would look at the source of it. And so some of the muscular movement in my neck and my face, delta does pick up on that. So its decibel levels are quite high I think because it is picking up on some of that muscular movement. If I hear like a high-pitched sound or a honk or a siren, delta goes up. But if I hear music and start to fall into that nonverbal music mode, the alpha waves will get higher and delta dips below it. I've done some tests where people listen to different types of music with the EEG on. And electronic music like this that doesn't have vocals, it seemed to be similar to what we're seeing tonight. Low beta and gamma and high alpha and delta, some theta. I also had them listen to a Beatles song, Eleanor Rigby, and obviously they knew it, they knew every piece of it, they had heard it hundreds of times. And I saw this really interesting synchronization where all the waves started to come together and go up with the chorus and then down into the verses. So it was almost like that became sheet music in itself. And all the waves really started to parallel. And I think that's what the woman I knew at NYU was saying is all the waves start to sync and kind of swim together when it's in a groove that's well cut and it knows what's coming, it's predictive, and then you could see the waves start to soar up even before it went into, all the lonely people, the soar of the chorus. You could see the brain predictively being like, here it comes, and it would ramp up. And then internally, it's trickier because internally my eyes are closed. So, looking at the data, as soon as I open my eyes, it's going to change the data. But generally, internal space, alpha is higher, and I'm able to create little flickers of movement in the other waves. And that can be through moving around the psychic spaces, as I mentioned earlier, through different meditation techniques or visualizations. Did that answer what you're getting at?
Yeah. Is there also a distinct difference between the shape of the sounds and waves between the external and internal, or is it more just like the specific stimuli that you're getting or being experiencing?
So will the visual of it change based on if it's internal or external? Is that the question?
Mm-hmm.
I think with internal, you start to get more of the rhythmic biomorphic movements, because when my eyes are closed, the stimulation is the rhythms of the body, like the heart and the flow of the mind. Whereas external, it tends to be more chaotic because the external world's more chaotic. There's more stimulation, there's more things to pick up and process and look for patterns in. So that's one of the reasons I feel that the output, when my eyes are closed, is more musical, because music inherently has rhythms in it. And it's starting to pick up on the internal rhythms of the body, and it feels more musical. Whereas eyes open always feels and sounds more chaotic to me. Yeah.
Have you ever played through a piece like a Bach fugue or something in your mind, just in your mind, something you're very familiar with, play through that in your mind, and how does that impact the music that comes out of this, or if you have done something?
I don't know if I've done that. I'm not familiar enough with classical, so I would probably think of a Beatles song or something. Yeah. I don't know if I've tried that.
That would be
I need
interesting.
to.
So,
Yeah.
Think about Eleanor Rigby.
Rather than listening to it,
go
and
through
is
the
it
whole thing.
similar?
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Yeah, I haven't tried that. I could try it, but this is a really stimulating environment where I don't know if it signal to noise, but it's something I will try quietly in my studio. Yes?
I guess it's kind of a weird question.
Go for it. I mean, this is a weird thing. We're making music with brain.
Experimenting and whatnot. And I don't know, with like music and different genres and stuff, there's been experimenting to understand different sounds. Have you done any experimenting with things that might change what your brain is doing? Per se, like let's say for something with like a melatonin in it, or let's say you drank alcohol and then
Sure. I was at a festival in August, and I found a friend that was coming off an acid trip. It was kind of the end of the trip, And so she had been tripping for like, it was a festival, so she had already been tripping for about a day or so. And I was like, am I getting censored? But that is something that's curious. It's not something I would test on myself, but I am curious to do a day of research with someone, and I want to get the system more nuanced because that's a pretty unique environment to set up. But to have someone do a type of either psilocybin or LSD, probably psilocybin, just it would be less of a time commitment, and see during the different phases of the trip which waves are the strongest. When I put it on my friend who was coming down off the trip, her waves looked fairly normal, similar to a sober mind, but she also wasn't on the up. One of my theories is that the alpha waves would be very low because often with hallucinogens, more information pours in, that filtering suppressive element that makes the mind functional in this reality goes away a bit during parts of a trip. I try to grab people that were tripping harder, but it's hard to like, hey, come with me to my car. I'm gonna put a thing in your head and read your brain waves and take you away from this party in the dark. So I just wasn't able to wrangle anyone.
But following up on that,
yes, please.
What about yourself and different different stimulus? So,
Yeah.
for instance, I don't know how much caffeine you drink, but have you noticed
Sure.
the difference, say,
Higher delta.
higher delta?
Yeah, that's the delta and theta tend to be the kind of the overstimulated, kind of stressed reaction. Yeah. I don't drink alcohol, so I haven't tried that. I would guess I've put it on when I'm super tired at the end of the night of just working all day and put it on, and the waves tend to be pretty low. So the general activity is getting pretty sluggish. I've also put it on when sad, because people are like, what do different moods look like? And I didn't see a distinction between sad and tired, because sad is chemical, and this, the brain is electrochemical, and this one picks up on the electric part of it.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Because you said you put it on like when you're napping, and then you get the feedback coming in, and it kind of loops you through.
Yeah.
If you put this on and just not have the sound on and gone to sleep and record it to see what, and like you said when you started, you had a really vivid dream, you woke up and you wrote it down.
Yeah.
You thought about like how it's going to do with your dreams and what's going on in your sleep and how it translates, and try to map that a little bit, especially right before waking?
I haven't, but that question comes up a bit of doing, getting data that isn't being influenced by the output, so the biofeedback isn't happening. I think a lot of different EEG research has done that because they don't have a built-in biofeedback. That's what's unique about this one is. So it's not something I've done. But I think I have, when researching the different waves, come across research that looked at which waves go up at different phases of deep sleep, REM. Yeah.
That would be interesting.
Part of the limitation of this system is the slippage with movement. So I think as I was sleeping, if I would just even roll over, I might lose hours of data. Whereas the more comprehensive caps that can go on with the gel, they're going to stay put better through a sleep cycle.
They do a sleep study with the electrodes and use superglue.
Super glue, yeah.
So you can just glue that to your head and see what
See what
happens.
happens. Yeah, that's chill.
That's a good look for you, though.
Yeah, yeah, just.
Do you have any plans on making the app publicly available?
Yeah.
It's at a point where so many ideas are coming so quickly that I talk to people, often ask that, and people have offered to be to manage a company to do that. And then I ran across this one guy in New York who he was interested in this system, and he had launched products before, and he said, don't make this into a project until you're really done with the research and development. Because if you do that, there will be a version of it out in the world that's fixed that you'll be constantly doing maintenance and customer support on. And that will really cut into your time and interfere with your research and development. Yeah, so if I ever choose a business person, I'll choose him because he, gave me what I felt was very reasonable advice. And the current focus is to find environments where I can do research and development with the most support. And then I believe as much as this process has been organic, I'm going to start with the dream that what it is to become will reveal itself in the process. That's a fine answer for an artist. That's not a really good answer for like an investor.
Have you done anything like this with Alzheimer's or dementia patients?
I haven't. The most unique mind I saw was that synesthesia. The name was Natasha. At one event, someone who was legally blind put it on, and we were seeing if there was differences, and I didn't notice a specific difference. And then with the little kids, my friend's children, the brain waves just kind of petered along the bottom. You won't have gotten the dynamics that we saw with the adult brains here. I haven't had access to someone with dementia or Alzheimer's, and that's fairly, trying to get someone in a disoriented state to put on a device. It's similar to the tripping situation of how do you ethically coax someone into revealing their brain to you.
Have you ever tried it on someone who's deaf? I know you don't get the feedback, but would that do something different maybe?
I would guess it'd be more similar to, well, not knowing how not having auditory input impacts the brain, but it'd be similar to putting on someone and not having the sound come out. What would be interesting as well would be there is a certain community of deaf that have created a rave culture because that came out of UK. I saw a talk by the guy who created it when I was in Berlin, and that works because the sound systems are so large that they feel it. They feel the bass, and so they can dance to it and have a similar experience as people with hearing. So that I think would be interesting, where the input wasn't auditory, and I associate that auditory so much with alpha waves going up, that if more of a direct body impact of the compression waves coming out of the speakers hitting the body, what that would do, if it'd be stimulating or create some of the calming, rhythmic alpha waves that come out with music. That'd be interesting.
Have you experimented with light as well, or colors and stuff, besides the sound?
That's something I want to do. So I have the visuals projected, but I would also like to have feeder lights. With this particular system, the background is grayish now, but when it's more in alpha, the background not moving, it's actually old VHS footage cycling. I don't know if you ever took a VHS camera and pointed it into a TV as it's hooked up, you get that weird feedback. So it plays on the idea of biofeedback, of doing a video feedback. So that's what that footage is, and it gets more of a red hue when delta is higher, and then a blue hue when alpha is. And blue is calm and cooling and feels more like subconscious, and red is more active. So I don't experience that reinforcement because it's behind me. So I would like a version where feeder lights are, when I go into subconscious, it becomes very blue. I become very blue, and I can feel that blueness if I open my eyes a little bit, and then red with stimulation. The other thing I'm really digging into is different ways to show the data. With this, as First of all, instead of just doing a traditional left to right EEG style, I'm doing it out of the center Rorschach style, so it's always symmetrical. And that was an aesthetic decision, a creative decision, because it's more beautiful. One of the things I want to do is experiment with different ways of showing the data that shows not just the decibel level, the amplitude level of the waves, which is what we're seeing here, but also the frequency. So a way to identify, right now it's flat, it's 2D. And how can I show this 3D? I want to create a 3D image where you can see delta is the lowest frequency and it has its own wave, and then theta is next to it and it has its own wave, and then alpha, beta, and gamma. And those waves to be able to identify not just the decibel level going up and down, it's flattened so you lose the frequency data. And I think there's something, I will learn more if I'm able to see the frequency data at the same time as the decibels. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks for having me.